It's well documented that we have, for quite a long time now, known where the real problem is in the Middle East. And in fact, the president adequately described it as the axis of evil. I guess my question is, how many times do we have to prove that these people are blowing up people now? Never mind if they get a nuclear weapon. When do we send them an airmail message to Tehran?
That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb. Anyway.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state. Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm very happy to be joined by Kyle Anzelone of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Now, it's a podcast that I've listened to for a long time, and he does a really good job of just giving us the straight headlines and facts and information of foreign policy, things that are going on right now overseas, and what is happening in the U.S. government that pertains to everything with foreign policy. Kyle is going to go over some facts about Iran, and what it leads to is a lot of myth busting. There is a lot of information out there, there's a lot of misinformation, and this kind of scratches the surface. He's going to give us a lot of good information and resources that we should look to when we want to find more information and dig deeper into this subject. So I hope you enjoy. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Kyle Anzelone. Hey everybody, welcome back to this show. I'm very happy to have with me Kyle Anzelone of Foreign Policy Focus. Kyle, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, Kyle, with everything that happened last year with Iran, things got really heated at the end of the year. So I reached out to you, and I'm thankful that you could come on the show today and maybe answer a few questions about Iran and tell us maybe what we need to know and possibly do some myth busting. How does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do the best I can. And I've read like all the greats like Gareth Porter now for quite a while, and reporting on Iraq by Patrick Coburn, and the great book Fool's Errand by Scott Horton. So, with everything I have and all the news I read, hopefully I could give you some good information.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do listen to your podcast, and I'm very grateful for just the style that you do, where you give us the headlines, you give us the rundown, you give us the information that we're not always going to catch on the regular news. You've put a lot of work into reading about Middle East interventions, and both current and some of the stuff that maybe we're not aware of in the past. And so, can you give us a quick rundown of some of those current issues that kind of led to a lot of the hostilities that happened, last year, a few months ago, and give us an idea of some of the current issues that we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I mean, how far do you want? Do you want me to like quickly start 53 here and like go forward, or just go from Obama on?
Well, yeah. So the current stuff with the Trump administration, because I want to just set a scene right now of kind of what's been going on in case people are seeing some of the headlines from very recently, and then jump back and get an idea of where all this started, if we can even do that.
All right. So, I guess one of the ways to frame this up would be like kind of what happened at Obama with the Iran nuclear deal. And, what that was isn't that Iran was attempting to make a nuclear weapon. And as the Israelis suggest, we're like 95% on their way there. Basically, there was a manufactured crisis, which is the title of Gareth Porter's great book on the subject. If anybody wants a lot of detail on Iran's nuclear program, you just read that book. But essentially what happens is Iran has a civilian nuclear energy program, and for years and years, Houthis in the United States and in Israel and anybody else who has geopolitical interests against Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, use every single instance they could of possible technology that is used in both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy to say that, oh, look how close Iran is to making a nuclear bomb. It's never true. Even the own U.S. intelligence agencies say that maybe Iran had the idea of looking into starting a nuclear weapons program before 2003, but from 2003 on, it's clear that Iran had never had a nuclear weapons program. But anyways, we have this manufactured crisis that Iran and the U.S. have to deal with in order to improve their diplomatic relations. And so in 2015, they finally got a deal done. Hillary Clinton was no longer the Secretary of State, so a little bit of diplomacy could happen in Obama's administration. And they signed this deal that basically took all these kind of dual use technologies between nuclear and civilian weapons and really restricted what Iran was able to do with their civilian nuclear energy program. It really limited their nuclear medical program, different kind of isotopes they used to treat different kind of cancers. I don't understand it. I'm not a nuclear scientist or any kind of cancer doctor, so it's very hard for me to discuss that. But I do know that if you enrich uranium up to a certain percent, you can use it in some kind of cancer medicines. And so those are the kind of things that Iran agreed to give up in order to put out the fire caused by the manufactured crisis. And so then Trump comes in and really doesn't seem to know anything about the Iran nuclear deal. We talk about some of the myths like the pile of cash later and stuff like that. But when Trump comes in, he runs on a platform of I'm the most anti-Obama and does a pretty successful job when it comes to trying to push this Iran nuclear deal. And it takes him 2 years of his administration, but he finally has a hawk enough cabinet in place in 2018 to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and place sanctions back on Iran. This basically just increases hostilities between the U.S. and Iran, whether it's the U.S. alleging them being behind tanker attacks in the Gulf or supplying the Houthis in Yemen and them carrying out a major airstrike in September of 2019, not an airstrike, a missile attack. Cruise missiles and drones hit one of Saudi Arabia's main oil facilities. And, reports said that for a couple weeks, Saudi Arabia lost about half of its oil production capabilities. And so all of this is blamed on Iran. And, maybe it's true. It does seem like Iran does have some support for the Houthis now. Did they ship them cruise missiles or were the Houthis able to develop them themselves? That's maybe different questions, or if Iran provided some of the, blueprints for the missiles or something like that, how behind it, are the attack. But, to move on from that, this, eventually leads us to the point of hostilities where the U.S. assassinates Soleimani on January 3rd, and Iran responds by shooting some missiles at U.S. Iraqi military bases that house U.S. soldiers.
With the current administration, we saw a lot of pushback, and you've already referenced to it a little bit, but we saw a lot of pushback on that deal, and it was just completely thrown out. Is that right, with the Trump administration?
Well, it's a deal signed between, I guess, 7 parties, the U.S., UK, France, Germany, China, Iran, and Russia. And so the U.S. withdrew from it in May of 2018, I think maybe May 4th, I think was the date. And when the U.S. withdrew from it, then there's certain mechanisms in the agreement that said the U.S. wouldn't immediately put oil sanctions back on Iran. It was going to be 6 months or something like that. And so over the past, year and a half now, the U.S. has essentially gone from the I don't want to say minimal sanctions, but moderate sanctions that existed at the end of the Obama administration on Iran to, at this point, sanctioning every part of the Iranian economy to the point where, people are being doubled and triple sanctioned at this point.
So, I know I can go over all of the propaganda I hear about we need to show that we're tough and things like that. But when we're pulling out of the deal and we're putting sanctions on top of the country. What are we actually gaining from that? And when I say we, I mean the United States. What is the United States actually gaining from that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you look at the American people, absolutely nothing. But when you look at, the American War Party and the war state, so some body in, I believe it was Ben Rhodes in the Obama administration called it the blob. But this is, essentially the people who make a living off of war. It's the generals. It's the weapons contractors. So Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. It's the different think tanks and news outlets that do put out these papers that say we need more war, and then it's the journalists who report on these like it's just straight bat that this is what we need, and these are all the threats we face as the Americans. And so for them it works really well, because in one sense it seems like war with Iran really isn't a possibility. I mean, it's a country of 80 million people. There's tens of thousands of U.S. troops in the region. They would be able to really, really limit the amount of oil that's able to get out of the Gulf. When you look at their then ability to, have missiles, and not that this is really an offensive threat, and not that they have nuclear weapons to put on their missiles, but they have a very sophisticated missile arsenal that they've built up to defend their country, and, can inflict a lot of damage on the U.S. and our assets in the region, not the U.S. homeland at all. I think their missile range is about 2,000 kilometers. But this puts Israel in range. Again, tens of thousands of American soldiers, several American bases. Their anti-ship missiles could hit U.S. ships that are, either in the Persian Gulf or, out in the Arabian Sea. So, there's real casualties that could be inflicted on each side. And so it seems like there's a lot of incentive from the leadership of both countries not to actually commit to this war. I mean, Iraq was a disaster. Iran will be several times worse, right? And American leaders, really have to know this at the end of the day. And so it makes for like a really good pitch to sell weapons. Like, we have to deal with these evil Iranians, but at the same time, war seems pretty unlikely. That would be so stupid to do.
Right. So just everything kind of gets back to what, Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. What about the money? You mentioned that there was this money involved when Obama first started this deal, and I know that was a big source of contention or just talk in, on social media. What's the truth behind this money thing? We just paid off Iran with U.S. tax dollars. What's the story on that?
Yeah, so this is something that a lie told by Trump that really stuck. And he really, doesn't know anything. He just says we gave him all the cash, and he has his, way of saying cash that, sounds kind of goofy and unique. But he says this over and over again. And people say, there is something really strange there that the U.S. gave Iran as a part of signing the nuclear deal. It's also called the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Probably should have said that earlier. But yeah, so as a part of signing that, one of the things the Americans did is they recognized rulings by a couple international courts that said the U.S. had owed Iran some money. So prior to 1979, there was an American sock puppet that was in charge of Iran, and he was then overthrown during the Iranian Revolution. Hostages were taken, and the relationship between the U.S. and Iran gets off on the wrong foot. Well, when the U.S. sock puppet is in charge of Iran, and the U.S. never really predicts anything, so we have long-term weapons contracts signed with them, including to sell them some F-4 Tomcats, and I believe some of those are actually in their Air Force till this very day. It's amazing that even if we go to war with Iran, a country that's been the enemy of the United States for 40 years now, we're still fighting them having U.S. weapons. But so, when you buy a fighter plane like that, you pay for it up front, and the U.S. ships it out to you later. And so they were waiting for them to be shipped out. And when the Iranian Revolution happens, and of course after that, the U.S. wasn't going to, sell warplanes when, we were only covertly selling weapons to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, and actually publicly supporting the Iraqis. So, it does get a little confusing, but, 4 Tomcats aren't something that you can really ship to the Ayatollah under the table, I suppose. And so we, had to cancel those weapon sales. Well, there's a few $100 billion sitting in a, American bank account for years and years, and we say we're not giving the money back to them either. Well, that's their money. You know what I mean? And I guess as a libertarian, it is a little bit complicated because I'm sure if we give the money back to the Iranians, it's not like, we're giving the money to some average Iranians or, we're paying back the tax dollars from years ago. And I'm sure it's going to be the Ayatollahs that decide how this money is directed and stuff like that. I'm not saying that they, stuck in a big Al Qaeda fund like John Bolton would like you to believe, or anything like that. But I'm not naive enough to believe that this went to Iranians and was, the returning of the money to the Iranian people. But, there is this international court ruling, and the fact that you had to deal with these big entities, that states as they are. It was ruled that the U.S. had to give the money and the interest back to the Iranians, and that's what they ended up doing.
Yeah, it gets real murky. When we're just talking about, selling arms to, other countries. But I guess in the end, the winning narrative was, U.S. tax dollars are paying off Iran, for whatever reason, just obviously wasn't the truth. Now, you mentioned in here, you mentioned the revolution in '79. You mentioned puppet dictators. So now I think is kind of the time where we do need to back up a little bit and I guess see how we got here, because obviously a lot more has happened with the U.S. and Iran relations than just the last 4 years or the last 8 years. So I guess, can you get us back to that 1979 or 1950s, and what is it that's kind of led up to this point?
Yeah, when you're looking at like U.S. interventionism and, kind of the U.S. becoming the world empire, of course, you could go back, even to Western expansion or the, Spanish-American War is usually a kind of a popular start there. But, the CIA starts doing coups, and one of the very early ones is in Iran in 1953. And, I've read some competing theories on exactly why the CIA ends up doing this coup d'etat. How much of it is to combat the Soviet Union versus trying to keep British oil interest in, I think BP had a lot of money, involved in Iran, and that they didn't want to give up. And so they did a coup, and they put this, the Shah in charge of the country. And, I don't know a whole lot about Iran during the time as far as what the standard of life was like under the Shah versus, before and after. But at least to, a large portion of the Sunnis in the country, or excuse me, the Shia in the country, this guy was pretty unacceptable. And so the hatred and anger builds up until 1979. And that's when you have the Iranian Revolution come in, which wasn't immediately hostile to the U.S. Scott Horton often points out that, the U.S. was fine with the Ayatollah initially, I believe, leaving a Western country like France and flying to Iran to, kind of assume his role as supreme leader. And so it's not immediately clear, but then the students end up starting the hostage taking at the U.S. embassy, and this eventually ends up with the Iranians holding a bunch of American hostages. There's the movie Argo, which I think is a fairly generous American take towards that whole crisis and standoff there, but that's just, kind of what gets the whole relationship off on the wrong foot. And the U.S. takes Saddam Hussein's side in the Iran-Iraq war, which is extremely brutal and involves Saddam gassing Iranian people. And so there's a lot of reasons for hatred and, kind of long-standing grievances between the U.S. and Iran. Well, I guess at least on one side of the whole thing. Of course, as I mentioned earlier on the show, the U.S. was, the Iran-Contra affairs going on during the Iran-Iraq war as well, where the Israelis are helping facilitate U.S. Arms going to the Iranians. There's also the shoot down of Iranian flight, I believe number 755 over the Persian Gulf. It was a U.S. ship that the captain says he mistakenly, shot down, believing it was coming in for a, bombing run. However, looking at all the evidence, the plane had whatever communications on to clearly indicate it was a civilian plane, and it wasn't actually going in the motion that a bomber would, as the captain alleged. But for whatever reason, the U.S. shoots it down. Famously, this is where you get the George H.W. I will never apologize for America. I don't care what the facts are. So even after it came out that, that this plane was clearly not doing anything hostile, and it was at best a mistake on the Americans' part for shooting it down, you had then the vice president saying, we refuse to apologize. So that's just, I guess, some of the tensions from that area, and kind of how things got to the way they are. When you look at, I guess, the next big date would be 2003. Iran was, always in opposition to Saddam in Iraq, or at least, from 1979 to 2003. But then, you had the U.S. come in and take out Saddam, and in 2006, set up elections in Iraq, and they were popular elections, and the Shia are the majority, so the Shia won the elections. And, it turns out that the Iraqi Shia are pretty friendly with the Iranian Shia. And, there's some reasons going back to the first Gulf War, where the U.S. betrayed the Shia and, made them, the Iraqi Shia, that is, and made them even closer with the Iranians. But, just that's kind of the way it's all played out. And now the Iranians have essentially an ally in the Iraqi government.
Wow. That is just a whole mess to untangle here. And what we're kind of left with now is just this animosity, I think, from Americans toward Iran, that they're the bad guys, right? And so there's a couple of things that I would like to bring up that I think some people haven't heard of, or maybe if they had, maybe you can shine a little bit of light on it, though, explain it to us. And I know that right after 9/11, there was a video of General Wesley Clark, and he speaks about a memo where there's a list of countries that I guess the U.S. is going to invade. And I think that this gets into a little bit of conspiracy theory talk, but when I look into all of these big things, these big events, from 1953 to now, all the things that kind of have Iran mentioned, this is one of them. And so can you explain, I guess, a little bit about this memo from Wesley Clark, and I guess, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, so Wesley Clark was a general and talked about 7 countries that the U.S. was gonna overthrow: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. So, and I think there's also like a pretty famous George W. Bush quote where he's talking about going to the Pentagon after 9/11 and them telling him that, they're not just going to Afghanistan, they're going to Iraq. And then they're going on to, all these other countries. So, there is the fact that there is a paper that was written, and it seems generally to be the desire of some advisors and officials within the Bush administration to really do this, to knock off 7 countries in 5 years. I mean, of course, look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's absolutely impossible. We can't, build any nations. It doesn't work like that. But obviously, it's an over 20-year project, because even in Afghanistan, we're nowhere near a state, and it's been 19 years or close to it now. So, but they have caused a lot of death in the region. 1 million Iraqis died. The U.S. did end up, this is under the Obama administration, so not within 5 years, but supporting the Sunni opposition to Assad. And, even this just isn't like something that Kyle Anzelone's coming up with, but in 2012, Michael Flynn, as, the director of national intelligence, signed off on an assessment saying that, that program that the CIA was running called Timber Sycamore, supporting the Sunni opposition to Assad, risked firing up a Islamic caliphate in Syria. There's actually a pretty good article while I'm talking about this in The Hill, published February 3rd by Daniel L. Davis, where he talks about that at the same time that this is going on, the Shia government in Iraq is absolutely excluding and just, telling the Sunni population of the country that they don't matter, and, really not providing them with any support or any, protection. And so not only do you have the U.S. then supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was then operating in Syria, as well as other Sunni rebel groups that turned into the Islamic State, al-Nusra and, Jaish al-Islam, all these other, Sunni rebel groups that took up arms against Assad. And so, in addition to the 1 million people that were killed in the Iraq war, you have 300 to 500,000 Syrians and 100,000 or so Iraqis that were then killed during this whole Syrian civil war and the fight against the Islamic State. Somalia, Trump has really ramped up the war in that country. That's something that's not really talked about. All this impeachment talk, but the U.S. is fighting now a pretty big war in Somalia, dropping 100 bombs or so probably on that country. They admit a few score of bombs in the past year, but oftentimes they don't actually admit to the airstrikes until somebody actually confronts them and says, hey, I got a report that an airstrike was dropped here on that day, and then the U.S. Army will go ahead and admit to it. And sometimes even then they won't. So yeah, we've gone to war in many of these countries. Recently, Bashir was removed in Sudan after several decades of ruling that country, although I'm not quite sure how much U.S. involvement there actually was in that one. Of course, we overthrew Gaddafi in Libya under Obama, although Hezbollah and the government of Lebanon is, more or less the same as it was.
Well, you've thrown out a couple of names like Hezbollah, and so it reminds me of a quote that I think that we've heard probably in a few different ways, but I think it came out from the U.S. State Department, and it goes, Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. So I'm guessing this correlates to some of these groups that you just mentioned, but is there any sort of weight to that statement?
Not really. The groups that Iran supports are the Palestinians, who are oppressed and occupied by the Israelis, Hezbollah and the Shia of southern Lebanon, and the Houthis of Yemen. For a long time, southern Lebanon was occupied by Israel, and so there was some insurgent tactics used, and other people would describe them as terrorist attacks. While Iran was supporting that group, but since the Israelis have been kicked out of Lebanon, the country Hezbollah isn't using suicide bombers or anything like that. In fact, Hezbollah has been critical in the fight against the Islamic State and different Sunni jihadist groups in Syria. So, it's almost an anti-ISIS group there. When you look at the Houthis in Yemen, who are also described sometimes as like a terrorist or insurgent group, they're not. They've ruled the capital city and the majority population of Yemen now for 5 years, while the guy the U.S. claims is the ruler of Yemen has been in exile for most of those 5 years. And, his mandate to rule ended in 2012. This is crazy. I realized today that this guy that the U.S. Under Hillary Clinton elected to be leader of Yemen in 2011 in a one-man election was only supposed to rule through 2012 when they could set up more elections. It's now 2020, and we still assert that guy's the president of Yemen. So there's just crazy things like that going on in the Middle East. But the opposition to that guy is the Houthis, and because they're a Shia group, for years and years, the U.S. has just been claiming that, well, Houthi kind of says like Hezbollah, and they're all Shia, so I'm sure Iran is supporting them. They came up with a couple of bogus claims that Iran was sending them weapons. After like 4 years of this war, the Iranians finally, gave like some acknowledged help to the Houthis. But at the same time, this isn't a terrorist group. Even if they, and I haven't seen any evidence of them using suicide bombers or really terrorist attacks, they certainly have, used pretty sporadic landmines and IEDs. But this is because, that they're waging that kind of war. Like those are the abilities that they have. They don't have an air force. They just have some missiles and they set up mines because Saudi Arabia has an air force that's been bought from the United States, and they're just waging a brutal air war, in that country. So, their tactic is to use landmines and stuff like that. So it's kind of hard to find any examples of Iran supporting any kind of Sunni terrorist or anything like that. And so, no, it really doesn't make sense to say that Iran is a state sponsor of terror.
So going along with some more things that people say or maybe beliefs that we have about Iran, we're always assuming that they're the bad guys. We're always assuming that that they're the state sponsors of terror. And it's not to say that I'm sure everything that they do is good or anything like that. But it does help, I think, to understand some of the misconceptions that we have. And one big thing that I think kind of sits in the back of people's minds would be, what are the relations as far as the national feelings and anything negative that the nation of Iran might do politically towards Jews and Christians? That's kind of the big subject in the Middle East, where the American people might find a dividing line. So what are some things that maybe we should know about Iran nationally from a public perspective from the nation? What do they do or say, or what is their stance on Jewish and Christian relations?
Yeah, I saw this is always one of those questions where I'm going to say some things and people are going to, say like, I don't know, somehow that's pro-war. But the reality is that I would probably rather live in the U.S. than in Iran, just based on the amount of freedoms that you get in the way of life. You get all the time. Iran is hanging people claiming that they are, CIA puppets and stuff like that. I'm not sure how often it is. My guess is that you could get some pretty unfair trials in Iran. I'm sure, I'm sure the U.S. in like kind of Israeli attempts, to assassinate and, successful ones to assassinate Iranian scientists and everything like that probably makes the country a little extra paranoid. And so that like, that's probably some of the impact on that. But, at the same time, even without U.S. intervention at all, I probably much rather live in the U.S. But at the same time, they're certainly not the most oppressive country in the world. I would feel much safer traveling to Iran than, Saudi Arabia or the UAE. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the UAE locked up some British scholar that was trying to do his thesis. He was like doing some research or something like that. They're concerned he was a spy and held him for well over a year. So, these things happen all over the Middle East. As far as it goes, there's, I believe, about 25,000 Jews that live around Iran, mostly in the capital city, Tehran. And so I guess it always seems strange to me, and this is something that a friend of mine and occasional blogger over at the Libertarian Institute, Adam Graham, had pointed out to me that, you think if Iran was just concerned with killing Jews, they would start with the 25,000 inside Iran. You know what I mean? Yeah. And, these people are allowed to worship. I've seen some, different commentaries saying that, look, the synagogues are generally protected by the people. They're, not burned down. It's not like other areas of the Middle East where, kind of the Jewish community has been forced out in recent years. And, the people are allowed to live there and I guess live, successful enough lives, even in the face of crippling U.S. sanctions, to not decide to leave the country. I believe, generally there's, I don't want to say freedom of worship within Iran, but it's not like some other countries where there's severe punishments for it, or it's just not allowed. Like I don't think you're really allowed to be a Jew in Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia and the UAE that you mentioned, those two countries being allies with the U.S. So it presents that an irony there that that we're allied with these countries that'll execute you just for being Jewish or Christian, and then this other country that's obviously the bad guy to the U.S. right now in the Middle East, that they actually have people living in the open, worshiping in the open.
Yeah. And so, it's one of those things like where if we have this great, libertarian society, if somebody, on moral objection says, I don't want to do business with the Iranians, I would really, understand that. I would be like, yeah, if they make all the women that work there wear, headscarves or whatever when they don't want to, and that's something that you want to protest and boycott, like good for you. That seems like the right thing to do to me. But and if you had a free society at the same time, that would also mean boycotting, businesses like that in different countries around the Middle East, like let's say Saudi Arabia, where, up until recently, women weren't even allowed to drive. And, I'm not exactly sure. I know the escort laws have changed from, the point where it was like cartoonish where women weren't allowed to leave the house without a male escort, and to some extent can do that now. But those laws still do exist, and so yeah, that's just to point out that on a free and individual level that we should be able to do that, but making these big blanket judgments against entire countries doesn't work. It's certainly not an excuse or a reason for regime change. No matter how poorly the Iranian government treats their people, that's absolutely no excuse to go in there and take out that leadership. If those people, when decide a different government for themselves, good for them. And it doesn't make any sense to do. And I think it's, I guess, just pretty clearly an excuse to make war, since the prime targets here aren't places like Saudi Arabia, again, where women are very restricted, or even look at Israel, where half the population there is Palestinians and essentially live as third-class citizens.
Yeah, and it even just comes down to just the jokes that are in public. I remember in 2007, John McCain was on film, I guess, singing "Bomb Bomb Iran," and that sort of thinking I think is still kind of stuck with the majority of Americans that are for going to war with Iran.
Yeah, the way our politicians are so flippant about starting wars, especially one with Iran, where millions of people are going to die if the U.S. goes to war with Iran, but also hundreds of thousands of, not hundreds, tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers are certainly immediately at risk. And I would imagine that the death toll from the U.S. would be far closer to like Vietnam numbers than what we've seen in the terror wars. Although it doesn't seem like Americans are too concerned about the lives of American soldiers. I mean, nobody blinks an eye when the Afghanistan papers come out and 20 to 30 American soldiers are going to die in Afghanistan every single year. The Afghanistan papers are released by the Washington Post. They say that war is an absolute lie. And then some more Americans die in Afghanistan. Nobody goes, hey, shouldn't we hold somebody accountable for this war that's a lie that we're still fighting and still dying for? It's kind of a confusing thing to try to think about, because they're able to use this very flippant attitude towards war to start it. But even then, when it's thrown in Americans' faces, they seem really not to care anyways.
Yeah, it's it's a sad reality, and just such a disparity between the reality of war and just the enjoyment of these things like McCain singing this song, or the phrases, the common phrases that we have, like turning the Middle East to glass, or Ted Cruz saying, make the sand glow. And it's very sad the way that we can get really excited from the war drumming and just have no care for the very real outcomes.
Right. Mr. Christian Ted Cruz flippantly jokes about dropping nuclear weapons on the Middle East. I mean, as stupid as that is, because it would probably, in the long run end up killing Americans just with nuclear radiation and how much dirt these things kick up and how terrible they are for the planet. But even if it's not that, you're talking hundreds of thousands of just innocent children wiped off the planet. And that's like a joke to you. It just, seems like the 10 Commandments and God would have something to say about, just massacring people in this way. But, that's not the kind of thing that you apply religion to. It's just, kind of how things go in your personal life. I don't know. That just always really bothers me.
Yeah, and it should bother us more, and as far as Americans go, but these are the sorts of things that are said on national TV, and Americans are the first ones to get upset about seeing a video of someone in Iran saying "Death to America," but then we can go on TV and there's no problem with saying that we should nuke them.
Yeah, right. I mean, it seems, I don't know how people don't draw that parallel. Every time you hear somebody in the Middle East chant "Death to America," just watch a clip of especially the Republican debate, and you will hear somebody chanting "Death to the Middle East."
Yeah, exactly. Kyle, I appreciate everything that you've done tonight. You've gone over a lot of information, and if somebody wants to look more into this, either Iran or just more information about the Middle East and U.S. involvement, what are some books or resources that you would recommend?
I guess the first thing I recommend is go over to antiwar.com. I'm the assistant editor there, so I help Scott out with some of the viewpoints and stuff like that. But news.antiwar.com is typically Jason Ditz and Dave DeCamp just doing excellent write-ups on what's going on, around the world in foreign policy news. That's a major way that I stay up to date. After that, libertarianinstitute.org. That's Scott Horton's great institute there, and I'm the news editor. I write the daily news roundup, so usually 15 or so stories every day. I got them on there about things going on, mainly a focus on world events, but I do try to capture some of the issues going on in the U.S. I'm most passionate about. So mass incarceration, torture of prisoners, corruption at the Pentagon, all that's definitely covered in my news roundups. And then of course you got the great Scott Horton show that's on the homepage, and then there's great featured articles there about a variety of libertarian topics. But it's Scott Horton writing it, so there's a lot of foreign policy. And after that, books to check out. And look over at my bookshelf right now, a couple of things that maybe a little. Dirty Wars by Jeremy Scahill is a great book on a lot of these different things. A good one on Afghanistan, The Operators by Michael Hastings. And I know I mentioned it in the beginning, but Fool's Errand by Scott Horton is probably, you want to get a good idea of what's going on in Afghanistan, and also, a little bit of the rest of the Middle East, because when he explains things, he really makes sure he ties all the loose ends and knots together. And all these forever wars are kind of, in a way, feed off and a part of each other. So tons of great stuff in that book as well. Yeah,
that's a really good one. He's very thorough. And if we want to hear more directly from you, where do we find your podcast?
libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle.
Well, Kyle, again, I appreciate you doing this today. And hopefully we can do it again. And further on in the year, if things are still kind of going the way that they are, have you back on to, keep us updated.
Right. Well, there's enough hots in the U.S. government and the D.C. blob that if it's not Iran, it'll be another conflict. So, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I hear Juan Guaido is going to be the special attendee at the State of the Union tonight. So it looks like Trump isn't done with his foot on the gas for a Venezuelan regime change either.
Oh, man. Well, we'll be looking forward to that, I guess, and see how that plays out.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, dude. Anytime.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that you got some good information, some new information maybe. And I just want to point out again, it usually doesn't take long for someone to immediately turn around and accuse you of being a sympathizer with terrorism, or immediately you're saying that Iran is this wonderful nation when you're just trying to talk facts and you're just trying to talk about some things that are contradictory to current information and current rhetoric that's out there. But I recommend checking out all the resources that Kyle mentioned. Check out his podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with the monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways you can support us. So again, I'll have the links to the books and resources that Kyle mentioned. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe this power is illusion, the need to rule is greed, your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb. Anyway,